Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3 about American federalism, and this is Lesson 2, Benefits of Federalism. In this lesson, you'll learn about how federalism protects liberty, about how it provides unity without uniformity, how it allows for laboratories of democracy, and how it's responsive to the masses. In the previous lesson, we had this diagram illustrating the nature of American federalism, how power is divided between a central government and state governments that neither answer to each other, but are both created by the people, acting through their states, or I should say as people of states. Now that's a very complicated diagram. It's a complicated form of government. It hadn't existed really before it was created by the United States of America, though it does exist in some other countries around the world now too. So a natural question to ask is why choose to have a federal system with all its complications? Now one obvious reason was the necessity at the time of the founding of trying to maintain power within the states that were known and trusted, while at the same time create a central government that could allow the states to cooperate together more effectively than they were under the Articles of Confederation. But besides those very practical concerns in that specific historical moment, there are other reasons why a country might choose to implement a federal system, as several countries around the world have since it was first done in the United States of America. In this lesson, we're going to talk about 4 specific benefits of federalism that a country may consider as they choose to implement a federal system. You also in a federal system have a situation described here by James Madison in the Federalist Paper number 10, in which it becomes less probable that a majority in the country as a whole will have enough organization and desire and common interest to specifically invade people's rights. Now, the reason he argued for this was that in a country as big as the United States of America, there will be such a diversity of interests that no one group will ever be big enough and powerful enough to take over the whole national government and then use the mechanism of that government to oppress people's rights. So collectively, what these ideas point to is that in a big, diverse country, it's generally less likely that people's individual liberties can be intruded upon by a central government, particularly a central government that is limited in its powers. So this then gives our first benefit of federalism, is that by dividing government between the levels of nation and state and having a big diverse country, people's liberties are potentially protected in ways they would not be under a unitary system of government. A second benefit of federalism can be illustrated by the list on this slide and the list on the next slide. On this slide we have the medals won in the 2016 Summer Olympics by country. You can see that the United States was by far the best performing country in the Olympics. Now, just consider for a moment that the United States is drawing athletes from 50 states, 50 individual political units that in another situation could be countries on their own. But they've banded together, and in the case of the Olympics, they create one team to go and represent them all, one very powerful and successful team. This is but one example of the various states in the United States finding ways to cooperate and work together to support, in this case, one team, but in other cases, support one currency, support one armed forces, one Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. for the entire country. So there are situations like that where these diverse states of the United States can cooperate very closely together, be united in what they do. But at the same time, they are not uniform in what they do. They don't do things exactly the same. And here on this slide is the example of the top income tax rate by state. You can see some states, Alaska, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming, have no income tax, while the state of California charges its highest earners 13.3% of their income every year for the privilege of them living in California. So with the states charging various income tax rates to their residents, there is a variety of these in the country that then Americans can choose from. And what we've actually seen in recent years is there's been a general flow of wealthy people away from states like California with high income tax rates and New York to places with low income tax rates like Texas and Florida that have none. So while the country is united, like through its Olympic team, it doesn't have to be uniform and exactly the same wherever you go. So there's a second benefit of federalism. You can have a united country without the whole country having to be exactly the same. And the fact that the country doesn't have to be exactly the same then provides us with our next benefit of federalism. And this can be seen in the example of what's called a container deposit law. The first state to do this was the state of Oregon, where when a person would go in and buy a beverage container, whether plastic or cans or bottles or whatever it was, the law required them to pay an extra few cents on that container. That then, when they brought it back to one of the stores that sold these kind of things and turned it in, they would get that money back. This is a way to encourage recycling. And it was very effective for the state of Oregon. You don't see a lot of bottles and cans laying around there because at the very least, you'll have little kids that'll gather them up and cash them in to get money for candy. And some people have become very organized in collecting these things to get the money from recycling. Well, as other states around the country looked at this experiment, essentially, that was done by Oregon to encourage recycling of cans and bottles, several states have decided they like the idea and have created their own similar laws. If you look on a beverage container, you'll now oftentimes see on the label a list of states where deposits are charged on these containers, and you can then turn the container in to get money back after it's empty. So that's an example of an experimentation conducted by a state that then other states looked at and decided was a good idea. Another example is another law from Oregon where they decided that you could not pump your own gas at a gas station. Instead, an attendant has to come out and pump your gas in the state of Oregon. Now, this is a way for the state of Oregon to create low-skill jobs, essentially. And as other states around the country look at what Oregon did, generally, they don't think it's a good idea. There's only one other state, the state of New Jersey, that has a law like this. So, from these two examples, you see the state of Oregon experimenting with unusual laws. In one case, several states around the country looking at their bottle return law and deciding it's a good idea. And the other ones looking at the no self-service law and deciding it was a bad idea. And you can see how states can act as what we call laboratories of democracy. In other words, they can experiment with new laws without them having to be applied to the entire country at the same time. Other states can then look at the results and decide whether they're bad or good, and choose for themselves whether they want to have a similar law. By having federalism, experimentation can be done state by state rather than the entire country having to do it. The next example of how federalism can benefit a country and a people can be seen in what are generally considered to be local issues, such as potholes in roads or speed limits on streets, where the particular local conditions govern whether or not there is a serious problem here that needs to be dealt with in a certain way. So we have to ask ourselves whether these sorts of local issues, like whether to repair a particular street, are best served through national control or local control. Just imagine for a moment if you had to petition Washington, D.C. every time you wanted to get a pothole finished, as opposed to going to the local government to get it fixed. Obviously, you would expect less responsiveness from the national government than from your local government. Which then gives us our fourth benefit of federalism: responsiveness to the needs of the people. Local governments at the state level are closer to the people, more likely to hear their concerns, more likely to respond to their concerns than a national government would. So now let's review. What may federalism help protect? National defense, international trade, balanced budget, or individual liberty? Well, the theory is that by dividing the power of government between these two levels, that individual liberty will be better protected. What is an example of federal unity? Speed limits, the armed services, recycling laws, or health insurance rates? The correct answer is armed services, where the country as a whole has one army, one navy for the entire country, while speed limits, recycling laws, and even health insurance rates vary from state to state. Container return laws are an example of what feature of federalism? Interstate commerce, individual liberty, laboratories of democracy, or common defense? Container return laws are an experiment, first conducted by one state and then followed by others. So that's an example of states acting as laboratories of democracy within a federal system. To what will a federal system be more responsive? National defense, foreign relations, local crimes, or a nationwide epidemic? Well, maybe to answer this question, I need to be more clear about what it is. Federal system be more responsive than, say, a unitary system? Well, looking at it that way, the right answer is clearly local crimes, where you've got smaller local units of government empowered to deal with things. They can address those local issues better. Right, that does it for this lesson. The next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 3, about the first delegation of power, as we look to how federalism was really created.